Hello, this is One Man Left, and today I'm going to do a little bit of a different video for me. If you're my typical viewer, this is probably not for you because my typical viewer is pretty veteran status. But maybe you just watched the Path of Exile 2 introduction, the trailer, the gameplay, the Q&A, all that stuff that came out on Thursday. And December 6th, we have open beta early access, and there's a lot of hype around this game, rightfully so. It probably will be the ARPG that completely dominates the genre for a decade. I would say that might even be an understatement. I'm not. I'm a pessimist in this community. I'm considered a pessimist. So if I'm saying it, take it to the bank. But if you're maybe a normal ARPG player, you've played maybe like Diablo, Last Epoch, the Elder, Dark Souls games. You might look at this and say, "Oh, I'll try to play that." This is a very knowledge-based game. People that are lacking knowledge, usually have a lot to learn, which can be fun. But I thought I would go through a couple key points in this video that probably a lot of like 500-hour players know, but maybe wish they knew earlier. And maybe even some of these things people don't find out until a little later. But I'm just going to go right through and just hit all the points that you probably should know going into PoE 2. There are a few of these. There's a few pieces of knowledge that would really only apply to Path of Exile 1, but everything I'm going to go through in this list is a core building block of how Grinding Gear Games designs their game, and will absolutely 100% carry through to PoE 2. So, even with the information we have so far, all of this stuff should be translatable. So, number one, is the game money? It's free. And there's not even really like it's free with an asterisk. It's free. In 2024, the gaming industry has gotten really toxic, really nickel and dimey. You know, the AAA $60 games are trying to push to be $70 or $90, and then they've got hundreds of dollars of MTX after that they try to squeeze you out of. There's pay to win stuff. Don't even get me started on mobile games. There's very few companies left in the world in the world of gaming that are actually like moral, ethical companies. That seems like an oxymoron that you can't even be that, but like Grinding Gear Games is probably the only one I'm aware of. Remember, I'm the pessimist. You ask people, I'm the pessimist, okay? This game, it makes its money for microtransactions. None of them are pay to win. There's a couple that are pay to save time, which you could argue is pay to win, but I'll just go through what to expect with money in this game. You can play totally free the entire time. Like I said, how they make money is microtransactions. So this is my character with microtransactions on. Let's take them all off. All right. My character now looks like a dumpster. Congratulations. I paid money to look like not a dumpster. All right. Surprisingly successful model of business, but it will not make you better than you. It may make you feel better, but it will not make you better than your buddy that spent $0. There's really only one thing that is kind of a needed thing eventually, and that's the premium stash tabs, which you do not need for at least 50 hours, probably 100 plus, because you do not trade with other people throughout the campaign. And they've said that the campaign for PoE 2 will be 50 hours. You really don't even start trading once you get into maps for quite a while, till you've started to accumulate some items and currency. You don't trade with other people. It's actually seen as kind of weird. If you do that, unless you're doing like co-op play with a buddy to level. But if you do get to that point where you've made it past a 50-hour campaign, you've got committed to the game. Now you're playing a trade league. Probably the first and potentially only thing you will need to buy is stash tabs for selling items. They make this, you don't need them, but they save a tremendous amount of time and make it much more accessible. And this is like $10 to $20. And like I said, if you've made it this far, you've already played the game like 50 to 100 plus hours. To the first point you would ever consider needing this. And there's a good chance this would be the only purchase you ever need to make. There are different tabs for sorting different currency. Like, there's an essence tab, so that if you have a bunch of essence in your inventory, you can just quick deposit it in here and it sorts it. They do this for most of the different currency types and league mechanics in the game, but you don't need to buy them. Like, I have 15,000 hours in this game across 12 years. I am probably considered, like, the foremost delve expert of people that put out, like, YouTube content on Path of Exile. I do not have the delve tab. I just have a tab I named fossils that I just put my fossils in. Like, I'm the delve guy. I have 15,000. I don't have the delve tab. Like, you don't need it. It's just like the essence is quality of life, the div card's quality of life, the map's quality of life. These are probably the three biggest quality of life. The currency's really big quality of life. I'd probably get that. But all of these things, like, these are like several hundred hours into the game that you would need them. You can play this game totally free and literally not know a difference at all for 50 plus to 100 plus hours. After that, there are tabs that cost like in the $10 to $20 ballpark that they're not per league, they're not a battle pass, they're permanent. If you buy them once, you have them forever. And outside of that, you probably never need to spend money again. So yes, it's about the freest possible game that can still make money. Number 2, wording matters tremendously. There's a bunch of games where you just, something says, oh, this deals more damage, this deals more damage, and you actually don't know the math behind it, because Path of Exile is a very information-dense game, and it's a very, theory crafting, number-dense game. There's a lot of hard-tuned content that someone just kind of going in blind and just, going by, oh, I think this does more damage, is eventually going to get checked pretty hard versus someone who knows all the interactions on how damage multiplies and scales. And this is one of those 500-hour knowledge things that people wish they knew. But the biggest example of this is increased versus more. One example of this. If I have a character that does baseline 100% damage, and my total talent tree, I have all these things that say, oh, you deal more damage, you deal your increased damage, increased damage, increased damage, increased damage. And across taking all of these different points, let's say I get 400% increased on the tree. That brings my total damage amount to 500%. If I pick up something that says you deal 10% increased damage, it goes from 500 to 510. That is always true with the word increased. So that means I do 1.02 times damage. But if I found something that says you deal 10% more damage, it's 500 times 1.1, which is 550. Is 1.1 times damage. It's a direct multiplier. So for things that increase, more is always better than increased, significantly. So you really, to get numbers up higher, try to scale that. In other games, they're really inconsistent about this. I remember on the Diablo 4 launch, they had all these different damage types, like increased damage to close enemies, increased fire damage, increased damage to generator skills, increased damage on Tuesdays, and all these things were additive with each other, so they were all really bad because you had access to over 1,000% on all your gear. Except for one of them was vulnerable damage. And vulnerable damage was multiplicative versus all the others. So what you had was people who realized this early on that started making builds and they started reforging their gear for vulnerable damage. And what that meant was people watched these people play and they're like, they're doing 4 times as much damage as me. What's happening? I'm looking at their gear. It's all the same gear as mine. I've got as many hours farmed and they're doing 4 times more damage than me. What the heck? Well, that's because that person just had random stats and they had 1,500% damage. But the other guy had 1,000% damage and then 500 of that was all reforged into vulnerable damage, which effectively gave them 6,000% damage. So they just were doing 4 times more damage than the person that didn't know that vulnerable damage is multiplicative. That's very true in this game. Wording matters. It's incredibly consistent. Oftentimes they'll tease something new and veteran players will immediately know exactly how it works just based off the wording. There's a couple things that are a little sketchier on consistency, like the word recently was always kind of random, and then over the last years they've made it consistent around 4 seconds. So if someone says, if you've killed recently, it's if you've killed in the last 4 seconds. The only one that's a little shady is nearby. If something says to nearby enemies, that's a totally random amount, and people have kind of railed on them for that, for not making that more consistent. But they are, in the tooltip descriptions, becoming more and more consistent for some of the PoE2 stuff with giving an exact radius. So for the most part, with a couple exceptions, Wording is incredibly consistent. It matters a lot. And things that are additive versus multiplicative make a huge difference for endgame scaling. Number 3, don't believe sheet numbers. This is true for most games. Your tooltip damage doesn't really mean your real damage. Some of these numbers are very deceiving. Some of them are fairly accurate. Your resistance numbers are going to be accurate for the most part. There's almost no exceptions to that. These are real numbers. But like your armor in this game works differently. The bigger the hit, the less effective it is. So big hits kind of double dip, where they're even more deadly because they obviously hit harder. And then armor's even less effective against them. Whereas against small hits, armor works really well. So like this physical damage reduction number, don't believe it. Because if I get hit by a really, really hard hit, it might only mitigate it by 20%. Even though it's 90% against small hits. Same thing with like evasion. I don't have any evasion, but like your evasion on the sheet might say, oh, you have 68% evasion. But that's entirely dependent on the monster attacking you. It could be a very accurate monster and they hit you 60% of the time instead of 32. It could be a monster that has hits can't be evaded and they hit you 100% of the time. Damage is no different. You know, my tooltip says I have 55,000 damage. This character full ramp has like 60 mil DPS right now, and that's not even like the most extreme case. I've had characters that had over 10 billion DPS that had a tooltip of 38k. The number doesn't really matter. There's some skills where it is directly accurate. You might have like Righteous Fire says 4.1 mil DPS, and it pretty much is 4.1 mil DPS, aside from like a curse on the enemy or something that makes it a little higher. But it's the ratio between them, if you're like comparing an upgrade on a two-hander, should be fairly accurate, but you know, don't believe the absolute numbers necessarily on the character sheet. But there's a point to this later that will give you some clarity on that. All right, this is a unique thing, no pun intended, about Path of Exile, but a lot of ARPGs have what's like the legendary category. And the legendary category is usually like, you know, there's rarity tiers. There's a white item that's magic in this game that has 0 mods. Or a white item that's blank. Then there's a blue item that's magic that has up to 1 or 2 mods. Rare gear has 3 to 6 mods. And then there's uniques. In some games, this is like legendaries. But in most ARPGs, like a legendary is just better than a rare. And that is not the case with Path of Exile. In fact, there's not a single unique in Path of Exile that is literally just a pile of stats that does not get beaten by a rare. Not one. Every single one of them that's used, that doesn't mean they're not used. They're incredibly important in build making. But it's because of their unique effect. It's because they do something. This build I'm playing right now has a pair of boots that mean it considers me always at maximum charges. For some builds, this is a garbage item. It does basically nothing. And to be fair, this is a more universal unique. This is good for a lot of builds, but there are builds that don't care about this at all. And so they would just have a pair of rare boots with better stats that would be way better. This is a belt that only works well if you have this unique. So this is an example of like synergy. Like in a vacuum, these aren't as good, but the two of them together are a strong combination. So for the most part, you do not use uniques blindly for a pile of stats. Some of them do have okay stats and make for like good universal weapons or armor. But there's always a better rare item out there. It just might be a higher threshold to clear. But if you're used to playing other ARPGs, don't just see an orange item drop and think, oh, I have to wear that because it's better. It's not always the case. The most expensive item in the games are really, really well-crafted rares. 5, defense matters. That might seem obvious, but every game has a different ratio of like how valuable defense versus offense is. If you played World of Warcraft and you were a world first raider, and they had a buff that you could take that would make you take 20% increased damage, but you would deal 10% more damage, every DPS in world first racing would take it. 2-to-1 ratio. Because they would just go from 5 healing the fight to 6 healing the fight, and then their 13 DPS would deal 10% more damage. In Diablo 3, there was times where you would legitimately take an upgrade that was minus 10% tankiness and plus 1% damage. Just because the only hard check in pushing endgame was damage. Everything is just on a timer. It's who can beat the Greater Rift in the Lowest tie. It's pure damage. That is not Path of Exile. In Path of Exile, if there was an offering to you that was the dealer says you get 1% more or 2% more damage versus you take 1% less damage. Basically, everyone would take the 1% less damage. I would say a hardcore character is probably like a 3 or 4 to 1 ratio. For softcore, it's probably like 2 or 3. But defense matters. And in what we've seen so far coming out for PoE 2, defense is going to matter even more. Because if I open up a map right now, in PoE 1, I get 6 portals. So I could die 5 times and still complete the map. But in PoE 2, you do get 6 portals, but that's mainly for party play or leaving for loot. Because if you die in the map once, it's over. So it's not hardcore where you lose your character if you die. That's a game mode that this game also has, where understandably defense matters. But understandably, even in the softcore version of the game, this game really pushes you to consider defense and to get defense. So if you're in blind DPS brain from other games, you're gonna need to get used to valuing defense. All right, number 6. Everything has a weakness. This is a trap that a lot of people fall into when they start theory crafting in the game and looking at numbers. But I did this myself. I started playing the game. At one point, curses were really strong, and I started making a build around curses. I scaled 4 curses, and I had curse effect. I had high gem level, and I would put all these curses on the monster. It would lower their damage, lower their action speed, increase their damage taken, grant charges, like lower resistance. All of it together made me like deal 4 times damage and effectively take 4 times less damage. On paper, that sounded amazing. Until I met a curse immune monster. So the moral of the story for this game is the more you lean into one thing to get big numbers, the more you're setting up to get hard countered. Because there's basically a hard counter for everything. There's a few exceptions to this, but it usually means you're very knowledgeable about a build you're making. You're scaling something very high that you know has only a couple weaknesses, and then you have secondary and tertiary mechanics in that build specifically to try to mitigate those weaknesses. Those are really the only ways you can stack heavy into one thing and make an effective build around it. Which, to be fair, does happen, but it takes a tremendous amount of game knowledge. But don't lean too hard into one thing, or there will be a hard counter. There's never been an unkillable build in this game. There's been 3 times before where there was a damage immune build that relied on several things being up at the same time to become immune to damage. Obviously, those builds die when one of those buffs is down. So it's like a buff uptime damage immune build, and guess what? One of the buffs was down and you died. Other than that, there's never been an unkillable build. Even some insanely tanky builds, there's content in this game that can kill it in one hit. Eventually. Like, if you get arrogant enough and you push hard enough, the combination of, like, base monster type, inherent monster mods, arch nemesis monster mods, possessed, essence, ghosted, map modifiers, delirium layers, adjacent buffs from a nearby rare that's debuffing you or buffing it by being in proximity to it, there will be a 1 in a million case that will one-shot that character. You can make a character that can just face tank like uber bosses. At some point in your gameplay, you'll fly too close to the sun, and Stink Stench the Stygian will come in from the top rope with the people's elbow, and he will one-shot your brains out, even if you face tank every uber in the game at once. There's no unkillable build. There's a counter to everything, and it's more so about trying to cover as many weaknesses as possible. 7. If you're new to the game, this matters because cheating is very punished. This is different game to game, and it really depends on the structure of the game. If you're in like a MOBA, if you're playing League of Legends, obviously cheating is a very big deal. Because if someone like cheats to get to like Diamond or Challenger, it's a big deal. Like, that's the whole point of the game. So understandably, the community would be pissed off if someone cheated for rank. Then there's other games where it's kind of seen as like, oh, it's a solo experience. I'm just playing Pokemon Blue. So if I cheat, no one cares. some people might come into this game with that mentality for Path of Exile, but the game is very trading and economy based. Like 88% of the player base plays Trade League on softcore, and what a few people can do that would be cheating can affect the entire market for the game, which does indirectly affect everyone. And this game has been historically and still is very strict on cheating. One thing you might see is like real money trading, RMT. You might join the game, be looking at YouTube videos. You might accidentally stumble into some shady YouTube channels that present themselves really normally. And like the whole point of the channel is to redirect you to their RMT sites. And you may have a tough time recognizing like who's good and who's bad if you're just brand new. There's not many of them. This is a small minority. But if you see someone say, "Hey, buy my divine orbs. It's $3 per divine orb. Become rich. Play any build you want." Don't do that. You will be banned. There maybe are like people who've done that for years and had to remake their account several times that know how to dodge bullets. A new player would not be one of those people. You will be banned. You will lose any microtransactions you buy. This company hunts cheaters for sport. There was a racing season where people were using map hacks to have the map already revealed to win the races. They not only banned them, they made a main webpage announcement that posted 76 names of the people that were banned as like a wall of shame to the community. They hunt cheaters for sport. So if you see some video that says, "Hey, buy this currency for real dollars," understand that is not allowed. I'm not being like the hallway monitor here. I'm just telling you flat out, you'll be banned. But that's a good thing overall because it means it's a very healthy community and people don't have to go around paranoid that like, someone's manipulating prices, cheating, whatever. Like at least there's people doing shady stuff in trade leagues, but at least it's for the most part above the table and fair game. 8. We got third-party tools and websites. This has sometimes been viewed as a negative thing. I'm on the fence about this, but there's a lot of things in the game that are widely accepted community tools, and they're not directly related to grinding your games. Don't necessarily be sketched out by this. Like, a lot of these things are the norm. So, one of these, for example, is Path of Building. In the game, you have a talent tree, and to experiment with anything, you have to invest talent points, then regret orbs, and you don't get to exactly see what changed. So people have made an app that does all that for you, where you can see, oh, this will gain me 5.7% damage for these 3 points. Is that better than this one? How much would this gain me? Oh, it would only gain me 3.2% damage. So you can get all those numbers in Path of Building, and this is like an actually incredibly widely accepted thing. If you go to a YouTube build guide, they don't open up the tree and like say, okay, first you're gonna take this point, then this point, then this point, then use this. No, they link the POB. That's our communication method. It has all the items. It has all the tree path, some jewels, all that stuff. This is how people communicate builds in this game. And Path of Building is one of those tools. There's a couple other ones out there. I'm not going to go over all of them. I'm just kind of getting you used to the idea that this is the norm. Is a lot of the best tools in the game are third-party websites. And that's, they're community sourced and organic, but they're like incredibly widely used. Like 90+% player base uses these. PoE Ninja, it's not like a leaderboard because there's not like a high score. Unless you're looking at Delve, then you can see Steve. So that's kind of a leaderboard. But for the most part, this just gives you, meta information about what builds people are playing. And you can open up the character and see, what items they're playing. You'll see this guy's playing Molten Strike of the Zenith. Seems like a good build. But, you can see right now, 70% of the player base is playing Trickster. But it's the end of the league, and Trickster is a pretty gear-based ascendancy. What were people playing early on? what builds really shined early in the league. And, oh, look, it's 16% Slayer. And what skill were they using? Well, I'll guarantee it's Lightning Strike. Let's see. Oh, let's not look at Delve. Oh, we are on Delve. Hang on. No, that's actually... Oh, no, I'm not on Slayer. Hang on. 29% Lightning Strike. 21% Vol Lightning Strike. So half the player base is Lightning Strike. So, like, this just gives you a window to view, like, what is popular. Sometimes that's a good thing, because sometimes popular means strong, but I would say in this game, popular means not weak. Popular doesn't necessarily mean strong, it just means it's proven. Oftentimes the strongest builds are not high play rate, because if they do become popular, they get nerfed. So you kind of need to do unpopular builds to do, like, really stupid stuff. But if it's popular on this website, you can generally bet it's a safe build, it works. And then you can look at, like, the character and the POB. You can import this POB into POB. You can look at the talent tree. You can look at the items. But it might just lead you to say, okay, I want to play Frostblades of Catabasis. Go to YouTube and, like, look up some video guides on Frostblades of Catabasis. People do it differently, but that's a pretty normal way to do it. 9. Community specialists. So speaking of these, you know, things on YouTube, the game is so wide in terms of knowledge that there's not just like, oh, I'm a Path of Exile content creator, so here's all the builds. No. There's so many different build archetypes that are so hyper-specialized, there's so much game knowledge, that the community's full of specialists. I have like 15,000 hours in this game, and out of like 50 categories, I'm probably considered the foremost expert in like 2 of them. And that'd be like mana builds and Delve. There's so many things out there that just have their specialists, so, you know, if you want to play minion builds, you're probably going to find a guy named Gazi. If you want to play Righteous Fire, you're probably going to find a guy named Pox, who's going to be in for some bad news when he sees the recent PoE2 announcement. But every single sub-archetype in the game has their communities, has their content creators that specialize in that thing. So it's probably good if you're a new player to identify early on, like, what you enjoy. Do you enjoy shooting things with a bow? There's people that's most of what they do for build videos. You can follow them. Maybe you just want to make money. You're a money addict. You like hearing those tinks. You like divine orbs dropping. You love loot explosions on the whole screen. Well, you might find a guy named Fubgun. There's like 10 people in this game that are really good at making money, and 9 of them aren't snitches. So you can go to Fubgun, who is a snitch, and figure some of this stuff out. Every activity, not just every build type, every activity or build type or any specific community has specialists that you can, you know, tap into their knowledge on that subject. The 10th thing I'm going to talk about is possibly the most important on the list. That's why I saved it for last. But this is something that is in Path of Exile 1 and will certainly be in Path of Exile 2. It starts when you find a guy named Krilson. So this probably won't happen early on in your career, but later on throughout progression, you will eventually find a guy named Krilson. This is how you get started on fishing. Okay? So the way fishing works in Path of Exile